Before we get into the bulk of the book, and we're talking about the third of the book in A Norwegian in the Family, Big Frank, I want to talk to you about the amorphous quality of memory. In one point in Big Frank's book, he talks about being inside a movie and how his memories and how he visualizes them are sort of like movies at that point. And for myself, it's just an example. I find my memories are much more multimedia. What do you think about that, and does it how you shape the memories that each individual character has? How do you best render that, and do you have any comments about the first thing that I stated, the amorphous quality of
Uh, Not specifically. I mean, as I've said before, I guess my work, both poetry and the prose, memory is a big part. I mean, I could imagine someone in 500 or 1,000 years, like on some starship, saying, "Oh, Dan Schneider, he was the great poet of memory," or something like that, because uh, the way we remember things, to me, is versus the way it is one of the interesting dichotomies. I've got some interesting interviews coming up with some people that'll be dealing with some of this stuff over the next month or two, because I focused a lot the last few months on these actor interviews, and it gets harder to get the actors. So I'm trying to get some more interesting people to talk about things in that vein. But like Big Frank, I mean, we mentioned before. What's his name? Tony Luft probably has the most direct connection to memories with his every annual Christmas memories or fantasies about Buster Crabbe. Big Frank. There were some things with the memory. The whole trope with the sneakers around the wires for 22 years or so. Even though, I mean, it's a memory, his 22-year things, but that he sort of charts his life like that till the last time that the sneakers aren't there. That's almost as if Big Frank is holding back, and once those sneakers are gone, like 62 or 63, any chance for Big Frank to become a good person again are gone. The sneakers sort of represent his youth, some lost innocence, even though he was delinquent as a youth. Um, you know,
memory? Yeah, I thought of the ball poem it, with the sneakers, but obviously it's a much more complex and extended dialogue than that.
well,
But
I
it's interesting how he associates the sneakers with all the individual characters that he has too. So the sneakers, in a sense, get tied to other things instead of just his first initial memory where they were thrown up there and tied up in what, 8 loops or something? No,
yeah,
3 loops.
5 loops I think it is, but um, I think that segment of the book, and I've written many great scenes in books. I've written many great scenes in poetry and whatnot, but that scene probably serves the same function in this book as the whole chapter in Moby Dick called the Grand Armada, when Ishmael is looking into the water and he sees the mother. I think it's humpback
Yeah.
whales or right whales suckling their young underneath the water, and so he sees dozens of these in this crystal clear water. He sees dozens of these mothers suckling their young, and I don't think they kill any of the whales because they know that they need to have those whales grow up, and they have to harvest the older whales and the male whales rather than the mothers and the infants. And it's a great piece of writing. I think my uh, interlude with Big Frank and the Sneakers is maybe 2.5, 3 times as long as that chapter, maybe even a little longer. But it serves the same purpose in that it's instead of looking down into the water, Big Frank is looking up into the sky, and instead of living things and life coming to life, there's this reminder of death up there because the sneakers that were thrown up there, the boy who was bullied moves off, and I think I may have had him die early or something. The bully dies in World War II. A part of Big Frank probably has died in World War II for one reason or another. And so instead of looking down at life, Big Frank is for 22 years looking up at death, which is an inversion of the heaven and hell thing. And there's a lot of things I could go into about that whole scene. I think it's one of the great passages in the book. It's not only symbolic for the whole book and for all of the characters in the book, It's specific to Big Frank, and it's a believable thing, just as it's believable for Ishmael and the crew of the Pequot to look down and see the Grand Armada. So is it believable that a guy in mid-20th century would be looking up into the sky of New York, either up at skyscrapers, up at airplanes taking off from the various airports, looking up at the wires, looking up at the new TV antennas, all of this new technology coming. And here's this symbol of death, these old rotting Blanche sneakers or whatnot. And then during part of that, he goes off. One of the times he speaks with a pastor, a minister, or a priest, I guess it was, from one of the parishes, and he has some interesting conversations with, I think, a blind guy. It's also a scene. The sneakers is something that I grew up with, but there's a really interesting film, not a great film, but an interesting film from 1990 starring Harvey Keitel called Smoke, about a guy who owns a smoke shop in Brooklyn. And every morning he goes out, sets up his camera at the corner of this street, the intersection of the street, and he takes a photograph. And it's the same, it's like at 8 or 9 in the morning. He takes his photograph of things passing. And so he has something like 20 years worth of daily photographs. So, 365. So he's got almost like 15,000 photographs of like 15,000 days of the street corner in Brooklyn. And sometimes the streets are quiet and dead. And the character doesn't even go on vacation because he doesn't want to miss a day of taking his photograph. And Big Frank isn't that obsessive. It's every few weeks or whatnot when he passes by the spot. But he always has to look up, and there's something reassuring to him about this symbol of death that he sees, the symbol of his past. And it's one of those scenes that I think is not only about memory, but it shows, like I said, that Big Frank is a human being. And even by that time he's an irredeemable killer, it's not until those sneakers are gone that he's going to go from just being an evil killer to being like a super criminal.
Yeah, it's the residue of his past too, but when they fall, it kind of points towards what his future could become.
Well,
too,
and that's the thing, though. We don't know if it actually has fallen. They're just gone. It could have been that some electrical line worker.
Well, he imagines that they
right, but we don't really know what has happened. They could have just, in a snowstorm or a rainstorm, finally the laces gave way and they fell and they were picked up by garbage men. Some kids may have knocked them down, or maybe an electrical worker took them down. So there's this indeterminacy there too, and it's just it's a very powerful and very resonant scene.
What's interesting about this scene too, and you mentioned Tony Luft, I was going to make this point when we were talking about the amorphous quality of memory and how some are different mediums of memory and how they kind of imagine, but Big Frank seems to have more there obviously than Tony Luft, who is probably the stupidest character in the whole of the book. So he is able to explain some of his memories, even if he doesn't explain them particularly well. But when they lack a way to explain their origins in any way or explain their ideas, it seems like the narrator jumps in. So that's an interesting technique right there. Tony Luft rarely explains his past because he's not able to render and have any understanding in that way. But the narrator goes into the extreme of explaining it for him. So I have found that an interesting way to align some of the limitations of the characters.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things you have to do. In this book, because I have Dan Schneider, I have Manny Cole, I have Elaine Shaw, and sometimes I have unnamed voices, perhaps. I can do that. In different books, you don't have that. One character is maybe telling their own tale in the first person. You might have a third person narrator, or you may just get it offhandedly with a character talking about this or that, and they sort of sideways swipe by what's the real issue being discussed.